You're listening to the On Humans podcast, a show which makes new research about humanity more accessible to everyone and more meaningful to the big questions about who we are. I'm your host, Ilari Mäkelä, and today we continue the quest to understand the why of war and the how of peace with my guest, Douglas P. Fry. In the first part of this conversation, we approach this question from modern history and other such developments, and today we take a very different angle. We don't kind of go from the modernity backwards, we go from the very origins onwards, trying to understand where and why did war emerge as such a persistent, nasty part of the human story. I don't think that this requires much more of an introduction, but I do want to say one thing, which is that this is a topic that has been covered many times on the show before, including 1.5 years ago with Luke Lowacki, someone who very much disagrees with Douglas Fry, but also with Douglas Fry himself. And a couple of times I refer to our first conversation in here. So just to be clear, that refers to the very, very first episode I recorded with him, not to the first part of this episode that came out a couple of days ago. But besides that, I don't think we need much more to appreciate this. We will jump straight into Fry's thinking and my challenges to it. Let's go. Well then, if we zoom out and look at the question, why do we war? One of the ways to approach this, of course, is to look at the origins of war, which was the topic of our first conversation. Maybe we could play it this way. Maybe I could give a kind of summary in my memory of your position based on our conversation. And then you can, play the professor and give me a grade and tell me what I got right and what I got wrong.
Sure, I know you're a good student.
Well, let's see. There is a myth, according to you, out there, that when humans settled down in villages and later in cities, civilizations, war became less and less common. In other words, in the state of nature, before settled civilizations, war was a chronic part of human life. This was a Hobbesian world. People would be wandering in the wilderness, worried about who are we going to meet and how are they going to try to kill us and how can we kill them first. And you said that this view is not supported by the evidence, not if we look at the archaeology of what life was like before people settled down, mostly due to farming, but there are other reasons to settle down. And it's also not true if we look at modern day peoples, the very, very few people who have remained till the modern time, who don't store food for the future, nomadic hunter-gatherers, that they tend to be remarkably peaceful. And I think it's very important here for listeners to notice that you're not saying that indigenous people never have war. You're not saying even that hunter-gatherers are not warlike. You're saying that particularly the kinds of hunter-gatherers who don't have food storage, who don't have long-term permanent settlements, that they're remarkably peaceful. And actually war in the big kind of arc of human history, it intensifies as people have settled down. As you get these wonderful large civilizations that we learn about, they represent a big increase, not a decrease, in the amount of war in the story of humanity. How is that as a summary?
Very nice, very nice. I'll give you an A for that, sure.
Okay, excellent. And what should we add to that to get it to the A+?
So, what we could add to that in terms of archaeology, which I think is really important, is that there's two strong lines of evidence to support this more peaceful view of humanity. And one is that after approximately 10,000 years ago, there's just not really any clear evidence of war anywhere on the planet.
The oldest one would be, 14,000 years ago from, was it Sudan region?
So that has, since last time we talked, that's a restudy has come out on Jebel Sahaba is what you're talking about.
Jebel Sahaba, yes.
And interestingly, so that had been thought by some people, not all, to have represented an early massacre site. And the first significant point of the restudy, and by restudy, I mean very careful archaeological, looking at all of the material all over again with the latest archaeological techniques, building on what was done initially decades ago. And the study showed, first of all, with more precise dating, that it is older than it was initially thought. So it does push back to some 13,000, maybe towards 14,000, if you know that number right offhand. So it's older. But the next part then says, well, it's an old site with a cemetery. That's unusual. That's not new. That was just known. It's a cemetery site. But the new study points out that it wasn't a massacre. The bodies here in the cemetery that show, many of them show a great deal of trauma to the skeletons and wounds and projectile points or other weapon points embedded in what would have been the dead bodies, indicating violent death, certainly. It's a series of smaller events. It's not a massacre. So this has always been a bone of contention, whether this all happened at once as a massacre or whether it did not. So now it seems pretty clear that it was not a massacre. So what were these individuals? We don't know all the answers to this. Some may be homicides.
Yeah, I think it's important what you said there, by the way, just for listeners, is that your argument is also not that violence did not exist, but that it tended to be, as in your analysis of modern day hunter-gatherers, that the violence tends to be, interpersonal, some sexual jealousy, whatever, not this group attacks that group to annihilate them.
Yes, exactly. Maybe we should just step back into that little side box for a second here too. There's individual aggression, individual acts of aggression. War is a group phenomenon. War involves a lot of people. War involves intent to kill, not necessarily people but complete strangers. There's different definitions of war, but what I have done and what I see very clearly is that physical aggression is older than humans. There's cases of physical aggression in the archaeological record going way back. Is that war? It's not very good evidence of war when you just find one skeleton with a projectile point. So this is sort of an important distinction here. Sometimes you can't tell, and sometimes you get a pretty good inkling, but you still don't know, right? So it's complicated. From my reading of it, violence, aggression, and even some lethal aggression goes way back. But what I see from a variety of evidence triangulating in, right, not just the archaeological evidence, that there's very little reason to see war as being very old, nor very prevalent, very old. So with this particular site, that's the significance of what I'm pointing out here. So we don't see war going back very far archaeologically.
Yeah, no cave paintings of war from the Paleolithic, right?
No, exactly. That's true. And then the other point is much more specific and it's very important. And I do want to mention the specific idea that involves archaeological sequences as another powerful reason why war is not pushing war backwards into the past, far into the past, just simply does not make any logical sense to me. That is that you see patterns in different places where there is clearly no war archaeologically. Then you see increase in war along with changes in things like settlement patterns, settling down, population increase, perhaps locating sites defensively. And then you see this magnifying, more population, more defensive sites, weapons perhaps, lots of dead bodies with wounds. So you basically see the origins, plural, the origins of war in different places, but all very recently in the big picture of humanity, not the Pleistocene, which goes way back, the Holocene, which generally speaking is considered to start around 11,000 years ago. And so when I say 11,000 years, I don't mean this all happened 11,000 years ago. I mean, it happened within the last 11,000 years. So let me just mention a few specifics to make this real. If we look, for instance, at northwestern Alaska, I love this. War came in at year one, literally, or 2,000 years ago, right?
Okay.
This is where the first evidence of war comes in.
Were they hunter-gatherers then, or were they farming already, or what was society like on year one?
Yeah, no farming going on there, but gradual transitions. We had previously Inuit in what we would call a nomadic or mobile foraging type of society, right? That we're talking about. But there started to be shifts towards large mammal hunting. and other shifts, you get social complexifications.
Are they settling down, or are they still mobile?
They're still largely mobile, but you start getting changes. You get the first evidence of war coming in right at this point. So rather than me going too into the weeds there, let me continue by just pointing out that's one case. We can also look to the Valley of Oaxaca, which coincidentally, where I did my anthropological fieldwork decades ago, their war started at about 2,800 years ago. And there the sequence is extremely clear. Hunter-gatherers for about 5,000 years, no war. Then 3 chiefdoms, 3 villages basically, that showed social hierarchy, chiefdoms hence, rising up. Then 1 chiefdom attacking another and sacking the village, burning it down. Archaeologically shown, right? So here we have the data as when war started. The survivors of that attack relocated to local hillside, which ultimately over more hundreds of years became the famous archaeological site, Monte Alban, and the headquarters or the center of the ancient Zapotec Empire, which was, of course, an empire, and it was exacting tribute and standing armies and waging war like crazy all over the place. So there's another extreme sequence of no war to war. The Near East over about 9,500 years, so similar stages of development from no evidence of war, small little villages, before that nomadism and so on, settling down, starting agricultural communities, domesticating things, and a huge history there. Here's some other ones I'll just mention. For the book, we're going to consider the Calusa people of Florida. And that's a very intriguing example. If you actually look at the amount of fresh water available, that came in relatively recently. So no one could live in this part of Florida. And as fresh water came in, a small nomadic band of Calusa showed up there. And interestingly, this is a recurring pattern to many of these cases as well. And that's abundant aquatic resources. Because as opposed to the agricultural track towards complexity and ultimately likelihood of war, you're getting with hunter-gatherers also this parallel, very similar track towards settling down complexity, population increase, and war. And that's the case with the Calusa. They had developed a huge living fish aquarium type of container, just call it a fish farm, if you will. They'd catch the fish and throw it in here. There were walls to keep the fish in. And this allowed them to have a permanent sense of fish just available. They're going to throw a big celebration. Okay, let's go fry up those fish. But this allowed an incredible increase of population due to the really abundant marine resources that they had available to them. And so the overall point with these sequences you see in various parts of the world, all relatively recently during the Holocene, these developing complexity either by the agricultural path or by a complexification of hunter-gatherers where they become a totally different type of hunter-gatherer society. Marine resources are very often, or aquatic resources are very often playing a big part in this. And that's when war comes in. So this totally contradicts all these multiple origins of war in different places. It totally contradicts the idea that war goes way, way back in the human line. Why in the world would you see all these origins of war recently if war went all back?
Okay, well, let me give a couple of pushbacks. A first pushback to that line of thinking is that, yes, we might see a sequence everywhere where in the archaeological record, in what the archaeologists find, you have time when they don't find evidence of war, and then they start finding evidence of war when you start having more settled, more intense, higher population pressure, whatever, often captured under this term intensification. Okay, well, that might mean 2 things. One is there was no war before that, and then war comes in. Or it might mean that war before that did not leave any marks in the archaeology, and after that it starts leaving marks. For example, if you're a nomadic hunter-gatherer, very, very low population density, and you have a few ambushes here and there with bows and arrows, you're not going to have a beautiful fortified fort to dig up as an archaeologist. And so it is the archaeological record shows a time without war in the deep past, but that might just mean that war was the kind of war that doesn't leave archaeological tracks. That's a very common pushback I hear. What do you think of that?
Well, great question, important question. I'm sure your listeners would appreciate that. So for these sequences that I'm talking about, you have what is considered a good archaeological record. So if you talk in the grand scale of going back across the Pleistocene, yes, that's a very valid point. The older things are, the less likely you're going to find existing skeletal remains, for example, or even good evidence of campsites. And a related point, which is also a valid point, is when you have nomadic foragers moving over the landscape, as they did for millions and millions of years, they're not leaving much archaeological trace. So again, the archaeological part is an important part of evidence, but it's not the only type of evidence available. So these sequences I'm talking about address that because you have good archaeological records showing no war, then you see particular social changes occurring. So it's like, how do we know there's a hierarchy? Well, one way is to look at burials, and when you find out that some burials were buried with a lot of grave goods, others perhaps with less grave goods, and the vast majority without any grave goods, you go as an archaeologist, anthropologist, okay, this sounds like a chiefdom to me, where the chief is, getting all the grave goods, and lesser chief or chief's family some, and then most of the commoners none, etc. So again, archaeology reveals a lot, and it tells us a lot. The interesting thing, why I wanted to mention these sequences, is I wrote recently as last year, 2025, that to my knowledge, not a single person arguing for this war going very far back has ever addressed this issue of sequences. I'm primarily the person that has called them out and listed them, but anybody could go to the actual studies and find them themselves, but they're not doing that. And nobody has responded, again, to the best of my knowledge, to actually engage with this argument. How do you explain that? That's a huge important question. If you're going to argue the war originated long, long ago, well, how do you deal with all these multiple cases with good archaeological records that show that it's originating now, not long ago?
Okay.
So,
Next one. Let's assume that it's true that nomadic hunter-gatherers, those who don't store food, they don't have much to fight about because, there's not much to loot, etc. Okay, we get a relatively peaceful existence. Yes, some homicides. Yes, sometimes emotions run hot, but no war. At least not much of it. How about then the potential that these kind of, you mentioned Florida, the Calusa in Florida, they are hunter-gatherers, but they are following what you call the hunter-gatherer trajectory towards intensification of war, which is using these rich marine resources. They start almost looking a bit like farmers, but they're farming fish, and so we call them still hunter-fisher-gatherers. Okay, let's assume that pattern is right. Why are you then so confident in saying that this kind of marine resource intensified hunter-gatherer lifestyle, that this is so new, that this is a Holocene phenomenon? Why might it not have been the norm 20,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago? How do we know that, for example, the cave painters in France, that they were not people who had pretty intensified hunter-gatherer lifestyles in their dwellings? Why take nomadic hunter-gatherers as the model for what the long span of human history looked like, instead of thinking that, well, some were nomadic and probably some were already then farming fish or doing any of those kind of things? And by the way, because the water level has risen so much, most of the sites that would have been by those rich aquatic resources, the Florida style cases, they are now underwater. So we wouldn't really see the archaeology of it very easily. So what do you think of that pushback?
Well, I'll give you an A+ for that question. That's great. Several thoughts on this. I don't have a magic time machine to go back and see whether there were some complex foragers living in a particular area. Maybe there were. I don't know. But on the other hand, we don't have the archaeological evidence, or we have sparse archaeological evidence that suggests that this may have happened in some places, but not real clear. So what we do have in some places like South Africa is evidence of nomadic folks using the marine resources. And that seems to be the general or the overall pattern going back into the Pleistocene. It's sort of the immediate return of let's go down and harvest some mussels and take them back to the shore, and let's see if we can find some fish or octopi or whatever it is they're foraging, without the development of complexity. So a related argument here you can see is if complexity tends to leave more archaeological traces, as we're talking about, even though it's old. So there's just not really much substantiating evidence that there would have been a lot or common, or you use the word typical, these more complex, settled, warlike social systems existing. There's some evidence from Plateau in Russia. There's a little bit tending towards complexity. Another factor that, again, this is real life, right? Things are complex. Hunter-gatherers, the nomadic foraging mobile type, tend to have, not everywhere, but tend to have a cycle of being out on their own in little bands most of the time, but usually in the summer, wherever that is, or a period of abundant resources, a salmon run or something, then coalescing and sharing and having a great time, probably having some sex, arranging marriages, socializing, renewing acquaintances, seeing your relatives. And then you use up that resources and you all disband and go out again. This is again, a acknowledged forager pattern for many part of the world. So these things are reflected archaeologically in a few sites, which is interesting that there would be even some monument figures that are early on. I think it goes too far to jump to the assumption, oh, look, here's a stone monument and therefore it was complexity, or we had complex social organization. It seems to me more like a seasonal gathering. So if population increase gradually, very gradually over millennia, and then suddenly reaching a point where at least some parts of the planet start getting crowded or packed. And you see a solution to that in some cases is to domesticate and start growing crops so you can settle down your higher population and people can have settlements closer together and so on. And then eventually war comes in. And you have another model where people are moving around and just, oh, great, salmon, let's eat some salmon, no problem. Now we'll move over and you guys have some salmon. All of a sudden, a group says, well, look, there's no place to move anymore right here. Everybody's around and I guess we better settle down. And then it's another step towards, okay, so I think we better defend our salmon run because this is where we live. We have a high population. We need to look. Okay, so, these things are shown archaeologically. And it's shown as a pattern that makes sense. So that's what I'm trying to get to.
Okay, third pushback. Let's not look at archaeology. Let's look at the other big strand of evidence, which is the modern hunter-gatherers, the very few remaining hunter-gatherers, or those that remained in the 60s and 70s or whatever, and we have some records from. There's a lot of questions around this, but let's just assume that your interpretation is right, and these are not warlike. On average, war is relatively rare, almost not. I don't. Probably you're not going to say inexistent, but it's very rare amongst these groups. There are people who say that even if that is true, this is actually a very modern development. And that what has happened is that these remaining hunter-gatherers, whether they are the Kung or the Juhansi in the Kalahari Desert, whether they are the Mbuti in the Central African rainforest, whether they are the Batek in Malaysia, these are groups that are encircled by agriculturalists, sometimes even industrial modernists. They live in this kind of small pockets of remaining wilderness. And therefore, there are not many neighbors to fight with because they are encircled by these dramatic, much more powerful neighbors. Sometimes there are wars between them, but like you said in our last conversations, if you have some ranchers murdering hunter-gatherers, we shouldn't count that as hunter-gatherer war. I agree with that. But then it's kind of like, if assuming that we don't count hunter-gatherers fighting their, farmer, rancher neighbors as well, should they be fighting? So there's actually some evidence that that when you look at the records before modern anthropology from way earlier times, that there are actually quite a lot of mentions of violent conflict in the same regions, which now look very, very peaceful. So what do you think of this kind of, the modern hunter-gatherers represent an abnormally peaceful refugia pacified pocket of the world. Is this just a quirk of the late 20th, 21st century, that these people live in a place where, yeah, there's no war because they are like encircled by much more powerful neighbors?
Yeah, again, a great question. And there have been a study by Richard Wrangham and Luke Lowacki where they advocate initially, I believe it's initially, using only 6 examples of foragers, that somehow they have gone through this filter of
Living surrounded by other foragers, by other hunter-gatherers is the way they define it, yeah.
Yeah, to supposedly end up with this sample of only 6. The sample is cherry-picked. It's just what they select. They make as part of the argument that these are the only 6 cases of this on the planet. Well, unfortunately, I happen to know some ethnography, and by no means are they the only cases of hunter-gatherers living next to hunter-gatherers on the planet. Specifically, on peninsular Malaysia, the people there called Orang Asli have been living in contact with each other for a very long time. Hunter-gatherers living next to hunter-gatherers, different ethnic groups. Very nonviolent internally and non-warring externally. They're one of the peace systems, actually.
Are the Batek part of this?
Yes, the Batek are part of
Because there's an incredible quote in actually one of your books from a Batek person who was asked why, when some of the
Malaysian slave
traders, Malaysian slave traders are capturing their people, and this is a long time ago. This is like over 100 years ago. There was slave raids, and there was a question being asked, well, why don't you use your blow darts that you hunt with to prevent this, to fight back? And then this person was completely shocked and said, oh, but that would kill them. That would kill the human.
Exactly. It's a remarkable quote, isn't it?
Yeah, it really. Okay, and so you say that the Batek do live in a world of hunter-gatherers by hunter-gatherers, not just encapsulated.
Yes.
Okay.
Right. And then we can go to the Labrador Peninsula, this huge peninsula in Canada, which consisted of Montagnais, Niskapi, and East Main Cree bands. And they interacted peacefully with each other. They did not war. So there's 3 pipes to 3 ethnic groups across multiple bands of hunter-gatherers living on this huge area of Canada, Labrador Peninsula, not warring with each other. And then we could also, in Canada, for instance, go out towards the west, toward the plains, and look at a handful or more, to maybe 2 handfuls, of the nomadic forager, mobile forager bands out there, again, living in contact and proximity only with each other and showing minimal evidence of anything that would be considered warfare. And so it goes. So I just want to point the other extreme, and I published on this in 2018, critiquing it, is one of those 6 that Wrangham and Glowacki use. It's just obtusely named something about Canada and the northern United States. And then they proceed to list a whole variety of incidences of violence, all decontextualized. We don't know what any of them are. They're just ethnographers talking about violence. Some may be war, some may not be war, some sound like war, who knows? But the number of cultures includes the horse-riding Sioux and the Iroquois that we've talked about.
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, they are not hunter-gatherers, and horse riding certainly is not a place to see in a lifestyle. Yeah.
So I'm saying 2 things here, but basically, your main question was, well, how do I respond to this? There's another important response to this type of thinking, and that is, if you read widely ethnographies from around the world on foragers, and if everything was influenced by neighbors and encapsulated and this and that, you'd expect a whole lot of variations. Now, you do get variations, but you also get consistencies. And one of the consistencies is the disputes tend to be over personal matters, not over group and group conflict. That's a generalization that's borne out consistently across ethnographies, young and old, from here and there and everywhere. Chris Bohm pointed this out before I did, so I'm not the only person saying this. I think what we suffer from in many cases is a lack of reading ethnographies with an eye towards what are the patterns. So simply pulling out tidbits of, well, look, here's a case of an ethnographer writing about something aggressive, so obviously they were aggressive. That is not very sophisticated anthropology, honestly. You can put that in or not, depending on.
So the last counter argument, which is not exactly a counter argument, but something I do want to hear your thoughts on, is you mentioned earlier Richard Wrangham and Luke Lowacki. I've had both of them on the show. With Wrangham, we were very short on time. We did not really get deep into this stuff, but with Luke Lowacki, we had a whole episode on this. And he was very, in some sense, actually very generous about your work. He said that your work has really influenced him, has really shaped his view. He didn't say it this way, but I kind of read between the lines that maybe, maybe we went a bit too far. Maybe we were, trying to say that, the hunter-gatherers, they were like all very warlike. However, what he wanted to maintain is that, look, I still think that they made war here and there, just like nowadays. So let's, not his words, my words. Maybe there used to be a myth that the Pleistocene looked like 1943 in Europe, and actually it looks like 2026 in Europe, where most Europe is pretty peaceful. We're doing pretty well. But then you have the war in Ukraine. So given that someone like Luke Lowacki, nowadays his position is like, look, I think that it's not like they were necessarily as warlike as many of the societies we know from history books, but war was there every here and then. It sounds like the differences are, first of all, not that great, and secondly, much more difficult to really find an exact lesson, because there clearly is, he does think that there is a debate between the two of you, and I think you think that there is a debate between the two of you, or more generally between these two camps. What exactly is it when we notice that no one here is claiming these kind of absolutes, all war or all peace?
Well, stemming, I believe, from Richard Wrangham, way back towards late 1990s or so, has put forth this idea of there being psychological and biological predispositions, psychological traits, tendencies. These are all words for chimpanzees and humans to form coalitions to attack members of the neighboring group whenever the opportunity presents itself with some safety. It's not going to be too risky.
That's a strong claim.
It is a strong claim. So that's where this is stemming from. How I say this entangle the idea of aggression, human aggression, fitting in a mammalian pattern of aggression and restraint on that aggression. Mammalian pattern is for restrained aggression, not for lethal aggression. Not for coalitions trying to kill members of another neighboring group whenever the opportunity arises. No, not that at all. In the book I just wrote on conflict resolution, if anything, you would reason that you would see from cross-cultural evidence and from hunter-gatherer evidence that the main push is to avoid lethal aggression. Individuals show their restraint. I love this quote that Richard Lee puts forth for one of the Zuntuasi men that says, "Killing other men is what gets you killed."
Yes, who lives from the sword dies from the sword.
Exactly. So that's the individual restraint, but then other members of the community, as they talk about in the conflict resolution book, this is a human universal. And I'm not the first person to point this out. One of my other old professors, Donald Brown from UCSB, wrote a book, Human Universals, published in 1991, and conflict resolution he noted as one of the universals. Well, I expand on that greatly in the book. So what humans try to do is keep each other out of trouble, and restoring relationships is the central goal of this, and restoring harmony among group members more generally is a secondary goal. So this is where humans across cultures, right, across time, I would argue, and across cultures are coming from. And this relates to aggression, where we need each other. Yeah, sometimes we need to stick up for our rights. If someone's trying to kill us, we sure as hell better either run away or fight back, right? So we're not total pacifists by any means. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that humans have been subjected to the same selection pressures or similar selection pressures to other mammals. And of course, there's some unique features to every species, but the overall pattern is restraint, restraint, restraint across mammals.
Can we see the contrast then being as one where you see people like Richard Wrangham and those around him thinking that that war is in some sense the natural outcome when you just let humans do what they do in any kind of social environment because we have an adaptation to form alliances and kill outgroup members when it's safe and easy. That's just what we do. Whereas if we think more along the lines of how you see the picture, then we have a very interesting question: why war? Why are the history books so full of war? And that, to me, I think is a very good question then to ask. Why did war emerge as such a typical pattern of the human story?
Well, there's the emergence originally, the origins, and I think we have some answers to that one from what we were talking about earlier of crowding, population density rise, population increase, less space, not being able to move. And from there, additional factors, causal factors for wars have multiplied over centuries, over millennia and centuries in terms of what people get out of this and what are the movers for it and so forth. I don't think there is just one causal explanation as to why we have wars. I think there's many interacting types of reasons why humans go to war. Some could be just surprisingly personal, like, the history of the beginning of World War I. Royal families getting into their tiffs, and the next thing you know, you have a continent at war. I mentioned before Brian Ferguson's interpretation, based on his wealth of knowledge around the world cultures, about leaders having played a role, which also, so leadership in a nutshell is a factor. Resources, obviously, people fight over resources in today's world, certainly, whether that be oil or coal and steel or territory or what have you. Anyway, multiple reasons I think would explain war.
And does that help then to think about peace, what we started with, how to avoid war? Because on the one hand, when we started with, we talked about very much on the what can individuals or what can societies do. But then, of course, if we look at it from this kind of macro perspective of when you have higher population densities, when you have more intensification, then you end up having war. But this is actually the question I asked at the very end of our first conversation, which is this can actually kind of sound like bad news because we are living very much in the Holocene, or now in the Anthropocene, as some people call it. So does that, when you look at it, not from the peace systems research, but when you think about it from this kind of archaeology, evolutionary anthropology point of view, when you take that kind of hat on, and then you think about peace, how to achieve peace, do you find any lessons from there, or does that give you actually a bit of a more helpless picture of the situation?
Well, in case you gather, I'm somewhat of an optimist, despite the topics at hand and so forth. But I'm not, I think, a naive optimist. I try to see what the human animal is capable of. And the human animal is capable, clearly, of killing one another and committing vast, horrible atrocities, of sneak attacks, murder and mayhem. We're capable of that. And of course, we're also capable of the total opposite side of this, of great acts of compassion and kindness and support and care and helpfulness, cooperation. So there's many capacities to humans. And this is what you would expect with such a large brain, just put it that way, neocortex in a brain, and this long period of infant dependency. I'll talk like an anthropologist again, all that time period for learning how to behave. And so hence we come back to why is it so important to emphasize norms one way or another? If you want to create a very warlike military society, well, you know how to do that. If you want to create a nonviolent, peaceful society like Batek, well, we know how to do that also. We're a very flexible species. I just hope that we can recognize the capacities we have, like the book I wrote long ago, the potential for peace, and achieve that potential for peace. And I think there's reasons why we could and we can. Will we do it? I've said before, I don't know. I hope we will, but it's going to be challenging. Another thing that I'd like to think about is there's always surprises. Like, who would have thought that the Soviet Union was going to just crack up? The Berlin Wall was going to come down. Who would have thunked it? So life is very interesting, and humans are very creative, and humans are very flexible.
Well, thanks. I really appreciate your time. And, it's 4 years ago, I finished asking you how has all your research shaped your outlook on humanity. You answered it then. Now you gave actually pretty much an answer to that question in your previous reply.
No, there's some consistency.
Yeah. So do you want to add anything to that, or shall we finish here?
I think we could finish here, but I'd be glad to come on after another book or two in another 4 years or maybe sooner, whatever. I really appreciate your invitation to have me on and talk about these things. It's been a great discussion. And one thing I like about your program is to actually have the discussion part of it and the back and forth. So kudos.
Well, Douglas P. Fry, thank you so much for all of your work. And again, your generous time.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
Okay, so that was it for today. Thanks for sticking with us until the very end. If you enjoyed this and you want more, you can go to the archives. You will find there an episode with Douglas Fry himself. You will find episodes with Luke Lowacki and Richard Wrangham, who disagree with him. And you will also find an episode with Brian Ferguson, very much in the same camp as Douglas Fry, who discusses not hunter-gatherers and the human story, but chimpanzees, and what chimpanzee war can and cannot tell us about humanity. But of course, there's not only things in the archives, there's many more things to come, so do subscribe if you enjoy this and want to have more material on humans. Thank you so much for joining, and thank you especially to the wonderful people who support this work at patreon.com/onhumans. Now until next time, take care.